Hi, when I started this blog, I had to think about what inspirational women I could interview. And I was trying to think about all the women I know, and I was astonished at how many were inspirational. But when I really thought about it, a lot of them were actually in my own family. So today I am interviewing one of my sisters, Suzanne Perazzini. Now, Suzanne is a certified nutritional therapist specialising in IBS and the low FODMAP diet. And as part of that, she is a full-time low FODMAP diet coach rather. She, of course, hasn't done just that throughout her life. She is also a qualified teacher and an award-winning author. So she can tell you about some of that stuff as she talks about her life to me. So over to you, Suzanne.
All right, I feel like I've lived my life in decades, and it seems that I progressed through a particular job or passion for a decade, and then I get fed up with it. And I used to think that there was something wrong with that, but I do know now that that's just a particular type of brain and person who does that. We work in cycles. So I've had many different professions. I was a teacher of English as a second language for about 12, 13 years in Italy and here in New Zealand. And also I was a fashion designer. I trained in Italy, and I ran a business here in New Zealand for a decade.
And I'd forgotten about that, and it was so long too.
Yes, it was about exactly 10 years. And then I wanted to homeschool Dario, and that's when I sold the business so that I could do that. So I homeschooled my son through most of his schooling, not all of it. He did go back in for the last few years so he could get the qualifications he needed to go to university. And that's when I started looking around for something else to do. And I got into real estate, and I'm on the administration side as a personal assistant to some of the top real estate agents. And I did that not quite for a decade. I didn't quite last. It was about 8 years. And then I was completely burnt out. It's a chaotic, very stressful industry. And one day I went home for the Christmas holidays and just never went back again. And at the time I had a website because I've had digestive issues all my life, and the website was exploring my journey to finding a solution. And it was just as a hobby, really, and I'd had a lot of recipes on it and articles, etc. When I left real estate, I realized that I still had to make a living, and I turned to my website for that. And I worked really hard at building up some sort of income. And then one day I realized that I could use what I knew to make a living. And the blog was about IBS and the low FODMAP diet, which along my journey I had discovered was the solution, and it's a scientific solution for irritable bowel syndrome. And there were so many people who were emailing me through my website because they had the same issues and they didn't know how to solve their problems. And of course, one day the light bulb went on that I could teach them how to actually implement this diet. And it just took off from there. The website was going for about 5 years, and I've been now full-time coaching for 3 of those years. So I work for nobody else, finally, and I help people every single day in my daily work life.
In fact, the perfect job. Not working for someone else, choosing what you need to do, but still a lot of good coming out at the end of it.
It is. It's certainly my perfect job. I have found through the years that I'm not good working for somebody else and making money for somebody else, especially when there wasn't an altruistic element to it, like in real estate. I suppose you could stretch it and say finding houses for people is altruistic, but I was working for the agent, and for the agent it was about, most of the time, making money. So now I've kind of ticked all the boxes in what I need in a job that brings in an income.
Yeah, I guess that's the thing that's kept me being employed by other people. though I'm starting to get fed up with it now, is that at least we talk about them being on the side of the angels, doing work that's good for society. But yeah, you have to certainly cope with some things on the way. So obviously you've done extremely well for yourself, but there must have been a few hiccups on the way. Is there anything you want to tell us about?
Well, I mean, there are always hiccups, of course. I think every working woman has had her hiccups through her career, or in my case, different careers. I mean, I can go back as far as when I was at university and had a part-time job working for a catering firm, and the boss was, I suppose, maybe in his 50s at the time, and his wife worked with us in the kitchen, and I was promoted from an assistant kitchen hand up to be the cook. And he kept making passes at me, and I just brushed them off. I mean, I was, what was I, about 20, I suppose, at that time. And then one day he actually trapped me in a room with nobody else and stood between me and the door. And he made a formal proposal to me. So it wasn't just the pass anymore. He actually asked me to be his mistress.
Oh, my word.
He used that word. He used that word, mistress. And I said, but you're married. Your wife's next door. He says, what's that got to do with it? And he said, and now, Suzanne, in return, you will have to be discreet about this. And it was like a given, an absolute given that I was going to accept this. He was a rich man.
Yeah.
And that me, a little university student, would, of course, jump at the chance. So when I said no, he was a little confused. And he asked me why. And I said, well, first, you're married, and that just goes against everything I believe in. And he says, yes, and what else? And I said, well, I'm sorry, David, but I just don't fancy you. And of course that offended him no end. And his way of defending himself was, he chuckled and he says, I always knew it. You're a lesbian, aren't you? So I suppose I shrugged my shoulders and said, well, no, actually, I'm not. But he walked past me and out the door. And you would think that would be the end of it, but of course he had been offended and his feathers were ruffled. So he continually took digs at me, especially in front of other people, about being a lesbian, as if that was actually offensive to be a lesbian. I mean, it was different times. We're talking about the 70s, but still, even back then, I never thought, well, okay, he wasn't calling me ugly or an idiot or anything, so that was just fine. And he continued to do that for the whole time that I worked there. And I didn't leave because of it, and he didn't fire me because he found a way to keep me. I was efficient in the kitchen, and also to make an excuse for my rejection.
Yeah, I mean, that sort of stuff happens still. That whole thing about if you don't fancy me, oh, well, you must be a lesbian, or there's something wrong with you, And hopefully it happens a bit less often or is less explicit. But you all hear stories of women getting fired for that sort of thing, especially young women.
Oh, I've got no doubt. And I've also got no doubt that he only kept me on because he actually needed me in the kitchen. I was the only cook in there, and he would have had to quickly train up somebody else. But during those years, I had a lot of those part-time jobs while I was at university. And there was another one where I just wanted a bit of extra money, so I applied for a job as a dishwasher at a restaurant. I absolutely did not want to be a waitress because I didn't think I would be very good at it. I don't like bowing and scraping to other people. And okay, that's perhaps a little bit mean towards waitresses, but back then that's very much how they were. They're a lot more respected today. But so I started off in the kitchen, washing dishes quite happily, earning my money, chatting away to the other people there. In fact, I found a boyfriend in the kitchen, and we were together for about 6 months. But after a while, I think a waitress left, and there was a space, and they asked me to go out front and be a waitress. And I said no, that I wanted to continue washing the dishes. And they said that I was too pretty I was wasted out the back, and they wanted me as a waitress. So more or less they kind of forced me out front. And I did my job there, I'm sure, efficiently, but I wasn't nice enough. to the people. It doesn't come naturally to me to do that. And I was fired. So I wasn't even put back in the kitchen, which was the job I had applied for. I was fired because I was too pretty for the kitchen, but not good enough on the social skills side to be a waitress. So,
yeah, I got fired from a job. It was a very short job. Having to serve breakfast at, it was sort of like the dining room of a motel, fairly near home. And I got told that I had to be an awful lot nicer to the people there, and they were mostly males, and I knew damn well what they meant. So that was that. And they did fire me, actually. I didn't choose to leave. We were sort of too young to stand up for ourselves. And fortunately, that whole occupation of being waiting in restaurants has become a lot more respected by a lot of people, fortunately. But I do hear stories that people still get treated like that.
And you can't get fired as easily these days. Back then they could simply say goodbye and you're out the door. I remember I had to fight to get my money that was owed too. I kept going back and back and back to get my money, and then they just kind of slapped it at me to get rid of me. But it would have been so easy for them to get away with it if I hadn't been a little bit assertive. But I remember thinking there was no recall at all. There was nothing I could do about that situation. So you feel very vulnerable with people in that kind of position of power to dictate, what can happen to you.
Yeah. And that's where sexism in the workplace is so awful, is because it emanates from people who've got the power over you, and it's quite hard to fight back. And even though we've got pretty good employment laws here in New Zealand now, you're still at risk of getting fired, and then you've got to fight your way through the employment tribunal and so on. It's extremely unpleasant, or can be.
I can't imagine having to do that. I only had one situation. I don't know that I can really call it sexism. It was more nepotism or something like that. When I worked for the real estate agency, I actually worked for a few different real estate agencies during that 8 years, but I worked for one that was owned by a family, and one day I got an email. I was working, as I said, as a PA for one of their top agents, and in the 6 months I'd been there, I'd taken her together. We had gone from number 6 in the country for that firm to number 2. So we were working really well together. But one day I got an email from a male in the company who I didn't know who he was, and he was asking for an explanation about something. So I sent an email back and told him what the procedures were and what the explanation was. And he replied with a very rude, patronizing email. And I replied to him and I said that I didn't appreciate the disrespectful tone he was taking with me, and explained again what he wanted to know. And then I never heard anything back. But apparently he was the chief accountant of the firm, and he was right up there on the top floor with all the bosses while I was on the bottom floor.
Yes.
And he got in touch with my immediate boss. She was on holiday in Vanuatu at the time, but he still got in touch with her over there and kind of lodged a complaint about me. So when she came back, she called me into her office. And as I say, I'd heard nothing more about this. And she said, "We have a problem, Suzanne. You were rude to one of the management." And I was completely puzzled, of course. And she said that I had sent him an email that was not exactly appropriate. I said, well, let me show you the email that he sent me. And she said, "No, that's not important."
Yeah.
She said, "You're going to have to apologize to him with his management."
Yep.
And I said, "Well, I think he should apologize to me. If you saw this email, you'd know why." And she said, "Well, that's not going to happen. So let's set this up so that you make your apology." And I said, "I'm sorry." I said, "Fire me. I am not going to apologize for his rudeness." And the conversation went on a little bit with me holding my ground, and I left the office and I never heard anything more. So obviously that immediate boss actually fought for me.
Yeah.
And she knew that I was a valuable part of the team and that my agent would have thrown a complete tantrum if I'd got fired over something like that.
Yeah.
So again, maybe not sexism, but certainly that position of power.
Yeah, it's the same sort of thing, really. Now, Suzanne, you need to tell us a bit more of just how successful your business is now.
Yes, I'm very proud of the fact that in the last 3 years I have taken my online coaching business to a 6-figure business.
Yeah.
And like a lot of online businesses, it's not that you have to work very long hours to do this, but the satisfaction is, in particular in my case, that I'm helping so many people to get rid of their IBS symptoms through the low FODMAP diet. So I do feel very successful with the business. I mean, we always want more, of course. I think that's human nature. It doesn't matter where you reach, you always want something more. But I'm pretty satisfied with where I've reached.
Very good. But it didn't just happen, did it? There was a lot of hard work in behind it.
Yes, initially, of course, I'd had the blog or the website for 2 years, as I mentioned, before I turned it into a business. And those 2 years were spent building up credibility and authority and subscribers as well. So you don't just decide you want to do an online business and it happens overnight. There's a lot of hard work that goes in behind the scenes. It's a little bit like singers and actresses who seem to be overnight, or actors, successes, but they've put in 10, 20 years of hard slog and working, you know, second jobs and third jobs to get there. So there was a lot of work that went into this in very, very long hours. While I was still working for the real estate firm, I was working full-time there. I would come home, cook the meal for the family, and then go into my study and work on my website until midnight, and then I'd go to bed, rinse and repeat every single day.
Yeah.
At the time, I didn't know I was building a business, but I knew that I wanted to do this, whatever it was I was creating, because there was a community that was getting built up around my website. Yeah. And they were being helped by all that free information I put out there. So then I took on a mentor who I paid quite a lot of money to, but it was kind of a do or die to get the business up and running. Yeah. And he was absolutely wonderful, absolutely indispensable to put me in the right direction of how to do this and to have the right mindset to do this, because my mindset was I give away free information. And so you have to make a very big shift in mindset to become a business person online. And he taught me how to do that. I'm still learning about how to do that. I still give away, obviously, on my website. The majority of it is free, but I do have a business that brings in a very nice income at the moment.
One thing I've found with the help that you've been giving me setting up this website and blog is how much is involved behind it to make it look professional. I mean, it's just astonishing. I've been over to Suzanne's place for help, what, about 5 afternoons now in weekends, and we've still got stuff to do this weekend. So looking back over all of that, what do you think you're most proud of?
Well, from the business point of view, I'm the most proud, obviously, that I've built a 6-figure business from absolutely nothing and just sticking to it through the years when nothing really happens and building it to a point where at the moment I get about 250,000 page views a month on my website. Wow. Now, when I first started, as Janet knows, you're getting 2 or 3 a day.
That's good, because at least it's not nothing.
Yeah, and you've all got to start somewhere, and you've just got to have that long vision, I think, for the fact that this will work as long as you keep on track. So that obviously for now is one of my big accomplishments, that I have this business that helps other people while supplying an income. I mean, I have the private things that I'm very proud of, a long marriage that's still a very happy one, an adult son who's very accomplished, things like that, a happy family, extended family, that we all actually like each other and we get together regularly, which is not always the case, unfortunately.
Yeah. And out of that, what do you think at the moment is most important to you?
It is still family, absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt about that, and it's when something terrible happens, like happened in January when my son had a horrific motorbike accident at high speed and had a 7-hour operation to attach his skull back onto his spine. And the family rallied around, and my business just didn't matter. The priorities are so simple in a situation like that. People drop things. Janet herself dropped work, ran out because I called her from 2 hours away at the hospital in Hamilton because I was having a breakdown while my son was in surgery. There was no hesitation.
Yeah.
Just family comes first. And I feel very sorry for families that are kind of split apart for whatever reason, because that's the kind of support that actually makes it possible to bring up good, healthy, well-adjusted children, and also to create a business life that you can give the most of yourself to because you've got that support behind you.
So, is there anything else you want to say or talk about, or we've covered quite a lot? It's really...
I mean, one can talk forever about the workplace and the things that go on there. Another one that I remember, and again, not exactly sexism, but definitely office politics. I was placed when I first started to work in this particular real estate agency in an open plan, like a lot of people work in today. Yes. And I had this air vent straight above me that would blast absolutely freezing air at me while it was adjusting the air, I suppose, for the whole office. But it was right above me. And I made a complaint to my manager, and eventually, after I'd complained enough, and my colleagues had photographed me with my coat on, my hat and my scarf on, working on the computer, they did something about it. And 3 men came down. One of them was one of the managers from upstairs that I recognized. And then there was another young man who I didn't know, and another man who was obviously the technician to measure the temperature. And he had this little device thing, and he kept measuring it around. And the thing wasn't blasting at that moment, and it was 22, 23, so it was all very acceptable. And I said, just wait for the blast. And the blast came, and he put it up, and he said 14 degrees. And he turned to the guys and said, this is not acceptable. And so I was happy. They went away. And the report came back from this young man. He was the one going to write the report. And the report said that the temperature was 22 to 23 degrees, so completely acceptable, and the case was closed.
Oh.
No mention whatsoever about the 14 degrees. When I went again to my manager and said, hey, what the heck's going on? She says, Suzanne, don't make a fuss. We'll just move you. And so they moved me away from the vent. So, and I must admit, I never saw anybody else sit in that position again after that. But complete, total lies by omission. It was absolutely mind-boggling.
That's one thing I read a lot in, you know, on social media and in the literature and everywhere, is this whole thing, particularly for women, you are told, do not make a fuss. Well, as far as I'm concerned, we have got to start making a fuss an awful lot more often, particularly when we come across stupid behaviour like that, any form of discrimination, anything like that. It does not do any harm for women to make a fuss.
It is a difficult one, isn't it, though, because of the way we're brought up not to make a fuss, not to show anger. We're allowed to cry, and I must admit a couple of times I cried in front of my manager, which I was not proud of, but it's the anger.
Yes,
that
yes.
And when you suppress anger, it comes out as tears, which then is seen as a weakness. So how do you win?
Well, I know. And then we're accused of being aggressive when actually we're being assertive. You know, blokes don't get that sort of description, but it's just one of those things we've just got to keep talking to each other, and particularly to younger women, about how to deal with those sorts of comments and that sort of behaviour.
We do, but it's really interesting how I'm not sure if there's a change yet in the next generation. I mean, I've spoken to young women and about their work situations, because I coach a lot of them, and a lot of them are expected to work long hours way outside what they're paid for. And they'll tell me, but that's the culture in the business that I work in. And I remember one in particular who was in insurance in London, who said I have to be able to drink alcohol, and on the low FODMAP diet you can't. She says, I have to, it's part of the culture of insurance, and I'm expected to go out to the pub and to have a drink. And I tried to explain to her that you were not going to get fired because you wouldn't have a drink with the boys in the office, that her health was far more important than that. But she never did stop. I see it over and over again with my clients, my young clients. They can't see a way out of the situation they're in with their work. They're reliant on the money, and they see the whole thing as, I said, a culture that they have to conform to, and that complaining means that they will lose their job, they will lose the respect of other people. So I'm not sure if we're getting there yet.
No, I talked to Fiona Crichton or a couple of weeks ago now, and yeah, it's the same thing. It's like we've taken several steps backwards. So it's trying to find solutions to that, and it's not just talking to young women, it's talking to young men as well. So it's going to be very interesting over the weeks as I talk to different women, getting, more and more ideas. And Fiona was talking about pulling them together in some sort of guidance and so on. So that'll be really interesting, and in the long run, to pull together everybody's ideas, because we've all got them. It's just a matter of getting them to work. Mm.
And would that be guidance for the young women or for the young men?
Both, I reckon. Both.
But what have the young men got to gain from it?
Well, happier colleagues, more productive colleagues, who knows? Yes. I mean, a lot of the younger guys, or even slightly older ones that I work with, are pretty good. They're fairly well educated in these issues, so it certainly can be done. Now look at, your son and my son. It's definitely possible.
It is possible, but we're talking about perhaps a more, can we say, intelligent strata of society that have been brought up by strong women, and therefore they've got an example. What about the others?
Well, I think probably it may not be down to any particular strata. I think it is to do with the parents, actually, no matter under what situation they're going to be brought up. And if they've got strong women as in their family, then they start to realise that that's actually perfectly normal and perfectly okay. So, yeah.
Yeah, so it's, so where do we start? How do we make the strong women be the strong parents to give the role model to these young men, when the young women growing up, it's a catch-22, haven't got the power?
I think in some ways we've gone backwards, but in some ways it is, things have changed. Just as an example, you look at one of the older James Bond movies now, and you think, oh my goodness, I didn't realise how horrific that was as far as the attitude towards women. So I think things are shifting. So yes, we've got to start thinking about the ideas. Yeah. Easier said than done to get there.
And of course, women have made enormous steps. If you go back to the obvious, the vote, and then the Gloria Steinems and so on of the world. But we do make steps forward. But then, like a lot of society, what happens is we do this equaling out thing again. And kind of an equilibrium is reached. While there was the strong movement for feminism, the men felt so threatened by it that there had to be a balance back. So then how do you leap off again without another Gloria Steinem?
I get a feeling that it's starting to happen again from, things I've been starting to see on social media. And oddly enough, the election of Donald Trump as president of the United States in some ways has made things much worse, but actually has activated women again to get out on the streets and to get into writing and social media and so on and start talking about that again. So it's funny that something so negative, I think, could possibly have really positive outcomes.
I can absolutely see that, because he is such an extreme of sexism and every other ism out there, that there has to be an enormous backlash. Well, there already is. Yeah. But even on a more structured, formalized sort of platform to fight against it and make an awareness that this simply is not acceptable. Whereas if you've got somebody like Obama, who's wonderfully respectful of women and of different races and societal groups, that's really not going to advance our case, is it? Whereas you get a Trump in and fantastic, let's fight against them. Let's actually unite against this kind of sexism.
Well, that's exactly what we do need. Well, thank you very much for that, Suzanne. It's been really interesting talking to you, and it's been fascinating talking to my sister in this slightly more formal manner, and just hearing some of the things that I actually didn't know about. So thank you very much once again for your time.